the real Cinderella, and the royal family that erased her name. The story you know is a lie. It was cleaned, polished, dressed in sparkles, and handed to you like a bedtime tale. A sweet girl, an evil stepmother, a glass slipper, a handsome prince who saves the day. But that's not what happened. Not even close. There was a girl, yes, but she didn't wait in a tower or sing to mice. She served in silence. She was property. She was forgotten by design. And when she finally did rise from the ashes, the ones who crowned her queen were the same ones who tried to erase every trace of her existence. This is not the fairy tale version. This is the real story of Cinderella and the royal family that made sure no one would ever know her name. It began in a forgotten corner of the kingdom of Lothalia, long before the capital was built, before the royal bloodlines were even recorded in gold. The records show a small estate, manor-born, but barely. A widower, once a respected diplomat in the court, lived there with his only daughter, a girl named Elira. Her mother had died in childbirth, and her father, though broken by grief, raised Elira with unmatched grace and intention. They had no crown, but they had dignity. The land was modest, the house aging, but her father still insisted she be educated, taught to speak like nobility, read books from the East, study languages, strategy, and court tradition. He never once let her believe that being a girl meant being small. She grew up sharp, not soft, not delicate, sharp like glass, clear, cold, strong. She listened more than she spoke. She asked questions others avoided. She remembered everything. And that was the beginning of the problem. When Elira was 10, the throne changed hands. The elder king passed, and a younger, more paranoid monarch took his place. King Thalen, a ruler obsessed with bloodlines and legacy. He believed power should be pure, that royalty should never be diluted with lesser stock. He issued a decree. Every noble estate must present documentation of their ancestry, prove loyalty to the crown, and cleanse their households of undesirable heritage. For many, this was routine paperwork. But for Elira's father, it was the beginning of their erasure. You see, he had married a woman of Romani descent, a woman the kingdom's aristocracy considered too foreign, too passionate, too dangerous. Even in death, her name was enough to end a legacy. They came for the documents first. Then they came for the family's title. Elira watched, silent in the stairwell shadows, as her father begged, reasoned, swore allegiance. He offered land, gold, ancient scrolls, anything to protect her. But it wasn't enough. A week later, he was found dead in his study. The report claimed illness. But no physician ever arrived, and no funeral rites were observed. His body was taken away before she could even say goodbye. And just like that, Elira went from daughter of dignity to forgotten servant in her own home. They didn't send her to the streets. No, that would be too loud, too messy. They did something worse. They transferred ownership of the estate to a nobleman loyal to the king, a cousin to the royal advisor. He brought with him a wife and 2 daughters, all freshly elevated from minor titles to estate holders. They wore silk with the stiffness of people who had only just learned how. They renamed every room. They redecorated with gold and portraits of themselves. But most of all, they made sure that Elira, the real heir, stayed, not as mistress of the house, as a servant. Too young to inherit, too impure to be noble, too dangerous to be free. So she was kept, like an object, a living ghost, and they called her by a new name, never spoken kindly, Cinder Girl, Ash Rat, Cinderella. Because her skin was darkened by soot from the hearths she was forced to clean, because the only warmth she was allowed came from the ashes, because it was easier to forget she had ever been a person at all. But Elira remembered. She remembered her father's voice reading to her beneath oil lanterns. She remembered her mother's bracelets, hidden in the cracks between floorboards. She remembered the layout of the estate better than anyone. She knew which floorboards creaked, which servants could be bribed, and which doors were never truly locked. And more than anything, she remembered who she was. She plotted, not with vengeance, but with patience. She read at night when no one was watching. She collected scraps of silk, hoarded broken jewelry, and copied letters left in waste bins. She pieced together court politics from rumors muttered by visitors. She listened through walls. She waited. And then the kingdom announced a royal festival, not a ball of fairy tale fantasy, a political showcase. The prince, barely older than Elira, raised on formality and fear, was to choose a bride, but not from love, from convenience. His parents wanted someone clean, someone without scandal, someone polished but not powerful, someone who wouldn't challenge the throne. They didn't want a queen. They wanted a ghost in a crown. What they didn't count on was Elira. She didn't have a fairy godmother. She had herself. One night, while the household slept, she sewed a dress from every scrap of fabric she'd saved. She lined it with the faded blue of her mother's shawl and stitched golden embroidery she'd taught herself by imitating the tapestries in the great hall. She wore her mother's necklace, hidden away for 10 years beneath a floor tile in the kitchen. And most importantly, she forged an invitation, stamped with her father's wax seal, which she had hidden for a decade behind the bricks of the chimney. She didn't sneak in. She walked in, with perfect posture, calm breath, and the name Lysandra on her tongue, her mother's name. A name long erased from the court registry, but still carrying the ring of nobility. She entered the palace like a flame slipping into silk, quiet, mesmerizing, dangerous. No one recognized her. How could they? The last time the crown had seen her, she was a child, dirty, ragged, erased. Now she was regal. Her voice didn't beg. It commanded attention. Her eyes didn't plead. They pierced. And when the prince saw her, he didn't fall in love. He became obsessed. She didn't flatter him. She questioned him. She didn't try to be elegant. She already was. She walked through the garden like she owned it. She quoted books he hadn't read. She challenged everything he thought he understood. And in doing so, she did what no one else in the room could do. She made him see her. When the night ended, he asked for her name. She leaned close and said, "You already know who I am." She didn't leave behind a slipper. That was a story invented later, a soft ending crafted by royal scribes. What she left was much more dangerous. She left behind her seal, a mark that could be traced. Within days, the prince announced his intent to marry the mysterious woman from the festival. The court scrambled. Her name was a mystery, her family unknown. But someone finally checked the wax seal on her invitation, and that's when they saw it, the crest of a man who had once defied the crown, the diplomat, the traitor, the father of the girl who now walked like a queen. She was Elira, the girl they had buried in soot. And now, they had a problem. They thought the past was buried. They believed ashes meant the fire had died. But Elira proved them wrong the moment she reappeared at the center of the kingdom's greatest stage. Her presence wasn't just a surprise. It was a threat. When the prince named her as his intended, the royal family didn't celebrate. They convened, quietly, urgently. Doors slammed behind marble columns. Advisors were summoned in secret. And deep beneath the palace in the chamber where no records were ever kept, a single sentence was spoken that set everything in motion. She cannot be allowed to ascend. Because Elira wasn't just a mystery guest, she was a ghost, a legal contradiction, a political danger wrapped in silk. The girl they had wiped from the records had come back, not just alive, but poised to wear the crown. And if the people discovered who she really was, if they learned that the royal family had once stolen her name, her estate, her bloodline, then everything could unravel. The monarchy's legitimacy, the trust of the nobility, the illusion of control, it could all burn. So they made a decision. If they couldn't stop the prince from choosing her, then they would shape the story themselves. Not the truth, a version of it, something softer, safer, easier to swallow. The scribes were called in first, not the public ones, but the royal historians, the ones who wrote the official narrative behind every coronation, every battle, every betrayal turned victory. They were told to draft a fairy tale, something beautiful, something vague, a mistreated girl, a magical evening, a symbol of purity and patience and luck, a love story, with no names, no family, no past, just sparkle and myth. They would tell the people she came from nothing, that she was chosen because of her goodness, her humility, her heart, not her knowledge, not her blood, not her truth. And if she didn't agree to this version, then she would be removed, quietly, finally. But Alira wasn't the child they remembered. She had seen them coming from the moment she walked through the palace doors. She knew the power of the truth, and she knew the cost. So when the royal court summoned her for a private audience, she dressed not in borrowed silk, but in mourning black. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She stood before the king, the queen, the high chancellor, the prince, and she spoke first. "You know who I am." The room fell silent. "You tried to erase me. You took my home, my name, my history, and now you want me silent again." The queen narrowed her eyes. The king clenched his jaw. The prince, to his credit, stepped forward and reached for her hand. But she didn't take it. "I'm not here to be saved," she said. "I'm here because I earned it. And if you crown me, you do it with the truth." But they wouldn't. They couldn't. The idea of a queen with roots the crown had once condemned was too dangerous. It would invite scrutiny, rebellion, cracks in the narrative they had spent generations building. So they made an offer. A compromise, they called it. Alira could become queen, but her story would be rewritten. She would be renamed, her origins reimagined, her mother's heritage left unspoken, her father's murder uninvestigated. She would be the face of their story, not her own, and in return, they would ensure her survival. It was blackmail masked as mercy. Alira walked out of the chamber without a word. That night, her room was searched, her letters burned, her dress torn, her necklace, her mother's, stolen. But she didn't cry. She didn't rage. She planned. The next morning, a letter arrived for the prince. No seal, no signature, just one line. "Ask your father where her body was buried." He did, and the king said nothing. His silence was the answer. For the first time in his life, the prince questioned everything. He demanded the court records. They were missing. He sent riders to the old estate. The archives had been destroyed. He asked to see the body of Alira's father. He was told it had been cremated, but no ashes had ever been returned. And then came the breaking point. A servant who had once worked in Alira's childhood home came forward. An old woman, half-blind and nearly forgotten by the nobility. She remembered the day the new family arrived. She remembered the girl who wasn't allowed to eat at the table anymore. She remembered the whisper of the seal being stolen, of the diplomat's books being burned in the cellar, of Alira's name being stripped from the family ledger. The prince believed her. And with that belief came rebellion, not from the people, not from the court, but from within the palace walls. He threatened to renounce his claim, to leave, to expose the truth himself. That frightened them more than anything. So the crown relented, partially. They allowed the wedding to proceed, but they buried the truth in plain sight. Alira would be called Cinderella, the name the royal scribes had already begun using in their embellished tales, a name that evoked soot, not sovereignty, ashes, not archives. They gave her a title, consort of the crown, but refused to acknowledge her bloodline. They removed every painting of her mother from the family halls. They issued a public story of a poor, sweet girl who found love in the arms of royalty, and they silenced anyone who dared speak otherwise. Elira became queen, but not by their grace, by her own defiance. And once she was on the throne, she did not forget. She began collecting stories, not royal tales, but buried ones. She funded libraries, protected scribes, gave asylum to artists, poets, and dancers who had once been hunted for their heritage. She rebuilt her father's estate. She found the children of servants who had suffered under the crown and made them scholars, advisors, protectors of knowledge. She turned her own palace into a sanctuary of memory, a place where the truth was written, not washed away. But the royal family pushed back. They called her cold. They spread rumors. They began rewriting even her rewritten story, painting her as tragic, then fragile, then fictional. When Elira died, some say too young, some say perfectly timed, the crown erased her one final time. Her name was removed from official records, her likeness never etched in stone. Her story boiled down to a tale for children, a girl, a shoe, a prince, a fantasy. And yet, she remains. In the margins of old scrolls, in forbidden books, in the whispered tales of grandmothers who remember the truth, in the buried corners of archives where the name Elira is scratched over but not fully erased. And every once in a while, when the light catches the page just right, you can still see the mark of her father's seal. She was never rescued. She never needed saving. She rose, not from magic, but from memory. And memory, no matter how hard the crown tries, cannot be buried forever. The records say she was a myth, a romantic invention for children, a tale told beside fires to make little girls dream of rescue. But the deeper you dig, the harder it becomes to ignore the cracks in that story. Because Elira didn't vanish when she died. Her story didn't dissolve into fantasy. It fractured, it scattered, and it hid in letters, in song, in secret. After her death, the royal family acted swiftly. They held no public funeral, no mourning bells rang, no official portrait was commissioned. Within a month, her image was removed from palace halls and coinage. Her name was forbidden in state documents, the only queen in Lothalia's history to never have her tomb marked. The official reason? Her health had failed, and her memory, they said, was too painful for the grieving king to endure. But the truth was simpler. Her presence was too dangerous, because memory, real memory, cannot be fully destroyed, only scattered, only rewritten. And so the rewriting began. The royal scribes turned Elira into something soft. They erased the sharp lines of her rebellion and replaced them with curves of submission. In their version, she was sweet, obedient, passive, a girl who didn't fight, but wished, who didn't challenge, but endured. They removed her name, replaced it with a symbol. Cinderella, not a person, a type, a mold to be used again and again. They turned her into folklore, and in doing so, they buried the woman beneath the ashes once more. But not everyone accepted the official version. In a village near the borderlands, there lived an old healer who claimed to have once served in the palace as a kitchen girl. Her memory was sharp, her eyes milky. She spoke of the queen who walked barefoot through the archives at night, searching for scraps of burned records, who refused to sleep in the royal suite because it had belonged to her mother's usurpers, who wept only once, not at loss, not at injustice, but when she heard her name spoken correctly for the first time in years. Elira, not cinder, not girl, not myth, Elira. The healer's stories were dismissed as fables, but in 1876, a scholar named Thomas Elbrecht stumbled upon something that changed everything. He was researching early Lothalian manuscripts in a private estate archive when he found a set of documents hidden in the false bottom of a storage trunk. They were letters, dozens of them, written in a tight, elegant hand, all signed E, all addressed to someone only ever referred to as L. At first, Thomas believed they were romantic letters, poems of longing, expressions of love. But the further he read, the more the tone changed. The letters spoke of betrayal, of history, of fear, of memory being pulled apart and replaced. They described a woman who had once ruled, who had once fought to preserve truth, and who feared that her death would be rewritten before the soil even settled on her grave. One letter in particular stood out. It read, "They will tell the world I was a story, that I never bled, that I never burned. But you know better, don't you? You know the weight of my footsteps in the archive, the sound of my voice when I said no. Promise me you'll remember. If not the world, then just you. If not my name, then what they did to it." Tomas knew he had found something dangerous, something precious. He took photos. He made notes. But when he returned to the estate the next week to request permission to publish his findings, the trunk was gone. So were the letters, and the family denied it had ever existed. He spent the next decade searching. In private libraries, in crumbling monasteries, in forbidden volumes sealed in red tape and dust. And slowly, he found more. A page torn from a ledger that showed a coronation with no queen's name listed. A piece of embroidery with initials ER stitched in the hem, initials that did not match the known queen at the time. A lullaby sung in the hills of northern Lothalia that spoke of a girl who walked through flame with a crown of ash. He wasn't alone. Others joined the search, quietly. Academics, poets, activists, people who saw through the polished lie of the fairy tale and began to whisper her name again, Elira. They found her in songs, in heirloom rings, in murals buried beneath layers of paint in churches where she had once funded schools. They pieced together her face from a dozen half-burned sketches and one forbidden painting kept in a locked drawer in the University of Belmora, a portrait of a woman in mourning black, with silver thread in her hair and eyes that saw everything. Still, the royal family denied it. They refused access to certain archives. They shut down inquiries. They discredited Thomas, calling him obsessed, mentally unwell, a victim of folk fever. When he died in 1891, his notes mysteriously vanished from the university archive. His name was barely mentioned in the obituary, but truth does not stay buried forever. In 1962, during the restoration of an old palace wall damaged in a fire, workers uncovered a sealed chamber. Inside were broken mirrors, a burned tapestry, and one iron box. Inside the box was a bundle of letters written in two hands, one of which matched the handwriting Thomas had photographed decades earlier. The letters told a different story, not of a fairy tale, but of a woman who had challenged an empire with nothing but memory. A woman who knew that if she couldn't survive the story, then she would become the footnote that turned into a headline 100 years later. That discovery was suppressed. The room was resealed. The workers paid to disappear. But one of them took photos. And in 2003, those photos were anonymously uploaded to an obscure history forum. That's when the name Elira began to trend again. And that's when the palace finally made its move. They issued a statement dismissing the documents as forgeries and deliberate attempts to undermine cultural tradition. They insisted Cinderella was a symbol, not a person, a timeless tale of hope, not a political statement. They leaned into the story, released new books, approved film adaptations, reprinted royal history volumes with even more sanitized versions of the myth. But the cracks were showing. More academics came forward. A museum curator in Vissel uncovered a dress lining embroidered with the seal of a house long thought fictional. A diary was found in the estate of a former royal advisor that mentioned the girl from the ashes demanding to be called by her name. And a child's drawing, framed on the wall of a farmhouse, clearly showed a woman wearing both a crown and a soot-stained cloak, with the name Elira scrawled beneath it. Now, in quiet corners of academia, her story is studied again. Not as a fantasy, not as folklore, but as resistance, as survival, as legacy. And still, the royal records refuse to change. Because they know what happens when a forgotten name is remembered again. They know the danger of a woman who cannot be erased. They know that behind every whisper of Cinderella, there is a voice, still alive, still burning, still waiting for the world to say her name without fear. Elira. Not a fairy tale, a warning. It always starts the same way. A post, a thread, a whisper online, a blurry photo captioned, "Not the Cinderella you remember," and beneath it a portrait with no name. The woman's eyes burn through soot and lace, and the comment section catches fire. Who is she? Why does she look royal and broken all at once? Then someone writes it, Elira. And from there, the story crawls out of its grave again. By the early 2000s, the fairy tale had become a global brand. Cinderella was not a person, she was a product. Books, films, toys, gowns, songs, always the same girl, sweet, quiet, saved by a man with a shoe. But somewhere beneath the glitter, people began to ask questions. Why did her name mean ashes? Why was she the only fairy tale heroine without a kingdom of her own? Why did her legacy vanish the moment she married? The cracks widened in academia, too. A graduate student in Prague uncovered the edge of a burned marriage certificate hidden inside a falsely labeled ledger. It bore the seal of Lothalia, and a woman's name scratched out with such force that the paper had torn. Later, using ultraviolet light, the name beneath was revealed. Not Cinderella, not Lysandra, but Elira R. The middle initial matched her father's known lineage. The paper dated to the year of her supposed death. Then, a historian in Marseille stumbled onto a shipment of antique manuscripts bought at auction. One of them, written in a cipher, turned out to be a diary. The author, a former palace aide, dismissed quietly during Elira's short reign. In that journal, Elira is not a passive bride. She is described as fierce, strategic, untouchable, a queen who refused to eat food prepared by royal chefs, a woman who carried her own books into council meetings and once declared aloud during a banquet, "I do not belong to your myth." The palace denied it. Again, they called the documents fake, the historians amateur, the evidence emotionally motivated. But denial has a shelf life, and this time the voices were louder. A social media campaign began. Say her name, Elira. Within days, TikToks reached millions of views. People dressed in dark gowns with ash across their faces, lip-syncing quotes from her hidden letters. A group of artists in Argentina launched an underground exhibition called Cinders Are Not Silent, displaying forbidden royal documents, embroidered recreations of her lost dress, and walls filled with burned quotes recovered from sealed archives. One quote echoed across the room. "If they must erase me, let them try. I am not written in ink. I am carved in memory." And then, something happened that no one expected. A child, 9 years old. In a small village school in southern Lothalia, a young girl was asked to draw her favorite fairy tale. She didn't choose the version in books. She didn't draw a pumpkin or mice or a prince. She drew a woman in black, standing in fire, holding a mirror, her face streaked with ash and gold. Her teacher asked who it was. The girl said, "Elira, the real queen." When asked where she had heard the name, the girl said, "My grandmother sings about her in the rain." That same day, the grandmother was interviewed. She told them nothing. But she gave the journalists a book, wrapped in cloth, pages yellowed. Inside were lyrics to songs never published, lullabies sung in hidden corners of the kingdom, all of them about the girl beneath the ashes who rose not because of a prince, but in spite of one. And now, modern Lothalia faced a reckoning, because Elira was no longer just a theory. She was a ghost invading headlines. Politicians were asked if they believed she existed. Museums were petitioned to open sealed wings. The palace was forced to make a televised statement. They reiterated the same lines. Cinderella is a legend. She represents resilience. She was never real. But the people weren't asking about Cinderella anymore. They were asking about Elira. That's when the leaks began. An anonymous source released palace correspondences dating back to the mid-1800s. In them were references to the E problem, mentions of destroyed records, and multiple payments to silent institutions for history preservation efforts. The term was vague, but the intent was clear. Elira had been systematically erased. Her tomb, her family estate, even her bloodline, vanished from the registry. Yet somehow her story endured, not in the places the palace controlled, but in the ones they overlooked. Family trees scratched in Bible covers, poems written in margins of banned books, rhymes sung on stoops, passed down like heirlooms. The truth had roots, and the younger generation refused to let it go. College groups formed Elira circles, gathering to read her recovered letters aloud by candlelight. A filmmaker released a short film titled Ashes and Blood, reenacting the confrontation between Elira and the royal court, with no dialogue, just silence, and a slow, defiant walk down the palace steps. It went viral. It won awards. It was banned in Lothalia. Tourism shifted. People stopped visiting the palace. They started visiting the ruins of the old estate once registered to Elira's father, now a crumbled foundation buried beneath wildflowers. Visitors began to leave offerings, ashes, names, tiny carved mirrors. It became sacred ground for those who believed in her, not as a character, but as a warning. A memory that said, "They will try to erase you." But memory remembers itself. The royal family, now cornered by questions, attempted to reclaim control. They commissioned a new documentary, glossy, scripted, narrated by a historian with ties to the crown. It portrayed Cinderella as a timeless cultural ideal, leaning into the symbol rather than the substance. But the audience wasn't interested. The comments were brutal. Every post was flooded with the same sentence, "Tell her real name." And in the midst of it all, another letter surfaced. This time, it wasn't hidden in an archive or whispered by a grandmother. It was mailed directly to a news station in the capital. Handwritten, signed with the same initials, ER authenticated as a match to the other surviving letters, dated mere days before her death. In it, she wrote, "I was not chosen. I took back what they stole, and if they bury me, make them dig again. Let my name be the shovel." It aired live. And Lothalia cracked. The Ministry of Records received a flood of formal requests to reopen the registry. A movement of teachers began rewriting school curriculums to include myth correction sessions. Street murals of Elira began to appear in cities across Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. A statue was commissioned by citizens, not of a girl holding a slipper, but of a woman holding her own name written in flame. And through it all, one question kept returning. If the story of Cinderella was always about hope, then why was the real woman behind it punished for surviving? Because that was the truth they could no longer hide. Elira didn't win by kindness. She wasn't lifted by magic. She fought. Quietly, brutally, brilliantly, and when she won, they called her dangerous. That's the legacy the crown fears most. Not a myth, not a monster, but a woman who demanded her place in history and didn't wait for permission. And now the world is remembering. Not the dress, not the dance, not the slipper, the ashes, and the girl who refused to stay buried inside them. The crown still won't say her name, not in press releases, not in books, not in the official archives guarded beneath the palace floor. To them, she is a myth at best, an inconvenience at worst. a fiction with too much truth hidden inside. But the world no longer waits for permission to remember, because remembering has become rebellion, and Elira's legacy wasn't built on thrones or fairy godmothers. It was carved out of silence. She didn't need a prince. She didn't need a glass slipper. She needed the one thing they feared the most: memory. You see, history isn't what happened. It's what gets written. And for centuries, Elira's story was rewritten until it became something she wouldn't even recognize. A bedtime tale, a pumpkin, a ball, a slipper too fragile to survive daylight. But that was never the girl beneath the ashes. That was never the queen who stared down kings, who rose from soot and ruin, who refused to bow when everyone told her to disappear. Elira didn't want a fairy tale ending. She wanted justice. She wanted truth. And when they wouldn't give it to her, she built it herself, brick by stolen brick, memory by surviving memory. After her death, the one that came too early and too conveniently, they tried to erase the ashes before anyone could follow the trail. Her estate was claimed, her portraits removed, her letters destroyed, her name scratched out in every place it had once been carved. They banned her likeness. They burned her archives. They rewrote her as a girl who waited to be saved. But Elira never waited. She dared. She acted. She walked straight into the palace with her mother's blood in her veins and her father's seal hidden in the folds of her dress, and she demanded her place. Not as a fantasy, but as a force. That's why they feared her, because the truth doesn't need an army. It just needs someone brave enough to remember it. And someone did. Then another. Then another. Until remembering her became a movement, and that movement became a reckoning. It wasn't just historians digging through the past. It was girls in classrooms wondering why every fairy tale starts with silence and ends with marriage. It was mothers telling their daughters that obedience isn't a virtue, it's a cage. It was artists painting her without permission, singers writing her name into lyrics, children whispering her story on playgrounds where the official textbooks still dare to pretend she never existed. Because Elira became something they couldn't control. A question. What if Cinderella wasn't rescued? What if she wasn't delicate? What if she wasn't meant to be a symbol of patience but proof that you can survive everything and still not be thanked for it? What if the real reason she was forgotten was because she remembered too much? That question burned through palaces, through press rooms, through the corridors of royal universities where once, even whispering her name would have cost you your degree. Now, that name echoes in petitions, in protests, in footnotes, in graffiti etched in gold ink under museum placards that still refuse to tell the whole truth. She has become a pressure the crown can't contain. And still, they try. They release new stories every year, new versions of the old lie. Animated girls who smile through cruelty, who are sweet through servitude, who are loved because they ask for nothing. Cinderella polished again and again, until she's unrecognizable, until she becomes a mirror to what the world wants women to be: quiet, beautiful, grateful. And yet, Elira slips through, in every crack, in every reprint, in every little girl who reads between the lines and asks, but what happened before the ball, or why was she never angry? Because she was angry, she was righteous, she was brilliant, and she made them rewrite history because she made them afraid. You can see her now if you know where to look. In the edges of fairy tales, in censored pages, in the footnotes of old scrolls labeled anonymous. You can find her voice in the lullabies sung not in palaces, but in kitchens. In the names of baby girls born to women who know that silence is never safe. And once you see her, truly see her, you can't unsee her. You can't go back to the fairy tale, because the real story is stronger, wilder, truer, and it doesn't end at midnight. Elira's legacy doesn't live in slippers or songs, it lives in fire, because she burned everything they built to keep her small. And out of those ashes, she dared to write herself back in, not as a symbol, not as a cautionary tale, but as a woman who refused to vanish, a queen who chose defiance over decorum, a girl who was told to disappear and decided instead to become unforgettable. So let them call her a myth. Let them polish the lie 100 more times. It won't matter. Because somewhere, right now, someone is remembering her. A teacher is saying her name aloud for the first time in a classroom. A student is carving her story into a thesis no advisor dares to challenge. A mother is humming her truth while brushing the ash from her daughter's cheeks. And a girl, just like Elira, is realizing that waiting is not how the story ends. It's how it begins. And if you too have ever been told to be quiet, to be grateful, to wait your turn, then this is your story too. Because they tried to erase her. And they failed. They turned her into ashes. And she turned that into a crown. If this story moved you, then subscribe to the channel. Because there are more names they've buried, more truths wrapped in lies. And Uncle Luke is going to dig them all up, one by one.